Stop scrolling! Stop it! Stop! Because I want to make you feel better. This is a public service announcement. Kind of. Conservative politics leads to depression. And I'm specifically talking about the mood disorder. And I'm not just making a jab at the idea that their policies leave the poor poorer and the rich with more ammunition to hunt the rest of us. I mean, literally, just like drugs or alcohol, conservative political thought causes depression. David Burns, the father of cognitive behavioral therapy, posits that one of the biggest factors in whether or not a person is depressed or not comes down to how they think specifically and how often they engage with what he calls cognitive distortions. What's a cognitive distortion? It's essentially a lie that we tell ourselves that leaves us feeling hopeless. These sort of thoughts rob us worse than Doug Ford does of our enjoyment of our families, in our hobbies, with our friends, or our workplaces. So, what are some examples of these lies? The first one is all or nothing thinking. Burns gives the example of a straight A student thinking they're worthless because they got a B. If the stock market isn't making our rich even more insanely rich, we're in a recession and everyone needs to take a pay cut or accept layoffs without complaining. They make us feel like we can't acknowledge the horrors of residential schools because if we admit that as a nation we did one thing bad, then we can never be good. You can probably think of other ways that politicians pressure you to think in extremes. The second is overgeneralization. This is when we take one bad experience and use it to assume that every time anything like that happens, it will always work out just as badly. Want an example of this? Ask an Ontarian if they think the NDP could ever win a provincial election. It doesn't matter how many Liberal or Conservative governments get caught with their dicks in the cookie jar. If Ontario elected the NDP again, it would be just like with Bob Rae. It wouldn't be like Manitoba with Wab Kinew or BC with David Eby. It would be like that one time in their past, and it can't be anything else. The third type of distortion is mental filter. This is where you take a negative detail in any situation and you dwell on it exclusively, thus perceiving the whole situation as negative. For example, some people defrauded the government when CERB was introduced. Therefore, CERB was bad. Is fraud and theft from the government bad? Yeah. But if the government had done extreme means testing in the middle of a pandemic, a lot of people who would have gotten unfairly kicked off the program and might have been too distraught or depressed to push for continued coverage. I've had people who are conservative who know that CERB was basically the only reason I could pay any of my bills during the pandemic tell me that CERB was bad, even though they know that I would have been completely screwed over without it. Next is disqualifying the positive. It's kind of like a mental filter, only it's even less rational. We disqualify the positive when we persistently look at neutral or even positive experiences as if they're negative. An example of this would be gay marriage. It's something that really mostly impacts the people who are in the marriage, and generally, since gays don't get married because they accidentally knocked each other up, though they may try, most of the time it means that they're only getting married because they're truly in love, and it's an overwhelmingly positive experience for them and those around them who care about them. But to hear conservative politicians speak about it, these life giving and positive unions somehow invalidate other people's family and somehow endanger other parents' kids, which they don't. Another example of this would be if I said that Stephen Harper only did bad things for me. Now, don't get me wrong, I loathe Stephen Harper, but even I have to admit that the TFSA accounts that he helped push ended up benefiting me significantly. Once I learned about them and the fact that you can put stocks in them, I actually managed to take some money that my parents gave me when they sold their house and nearly double it over a few years by investing in a certain stock that I knew a lot about because I have a possibly unhealthy fixation with a certain company, and their stock did well. So, on some level, though I may dislike Stephen Harper a whole heck of a lot, I have to admit that not everything that he did was bad for me. Most of it was, but at least one thing was good for me. Fifth on our list, jumping to conclusions. Two examples of this are mind reading and the fortune teller's error. With mind reading, this happens when we assume that people are looking down on us, regardless of whether or not they give any indication that they actually are. In fact, sometimes I've noticed conservative people actually come out swinging by throwing out their most out there perspective just so that they can quickly ensure that the people they've met know that they're kind of off their rocker and thus will reject them. Particularly, you see this when they're repeating propaganda that they ought to know can't be verified from other sources. When I started learning about this stuff, I remember popping into a small class that a mentor of mine was teaching. I knew everyone in the class, and when I poked my head in the door, they invited me to join. I participated in their discussion. When I spoke, people smiled and nodded. They even invited me out for coffee after class. On the bus ride home, for some reason, though, I started believing that everyone in the room just wished I would have shut up and never joined them, despite no evidence that any of them didn't like me. Thankfully, I'd been reading Burns's book and started the process of questioning my own assumptions and stopped the depressive thoughts. But it's truly crazy when you realize that we do this to ourselves. The fortune teller's error is when we imagine that everything is going to go wrong, despite having no evidence that it will. I often see young men on the internet assuming that they'll never be loved and that they're ugly just because they've never had a random woman come up to them and tell them that they think they're hot and want to start a long term relationship with them. And they fail to acknowledge that that's just not something that women do. Also, if you're a guy, you probably shouldn't approach a woman like that. A political example of this would be something like when Danielle Smith suggests that everything will go terribly wrong if Canada has Mark Carney negotiate with Donald Trump. In fairness, we have a lot of examples of things going haywire when people try and negotiate with Trump. But Carney has dealt with many right wing nut jobs in his day, and he's come out better than most people would. Next on the list is magnification and minimization. This can feel like basically everything that happens in the House of Commons. You've either got someone pretending that a private citizen defrauding the government and not being caught quickly is a sign that the Prime Minister himself was in on the fraud, or you've got people acting like the Freely Dumb convoy was just camping and not using sleep deprivation tactics to terrorize the locals in Ottawa. Your ability to accurately know how bad something is without exaggeration or minimization is an essential part of managing your own mood. Seventh is emotional reasoning. I feel unhappy and disconnected, therefore Canada is unhappy and disconnected. I feel alone and I watch too much political content on YouTube and it makes me feel something. So that feeling is reality. This was actually a huge part of the reason why Trump even had a chance in the 2024 election, beyond Elon Musk rigging voting machines and various Republican agents purging voter rolls. Prices were going up all over the world in large part because the Democrats were letting the markets freeball it in everyone's faces. And in the face of no steady regulations, prices for everything went crazy. Americans then decided they needed a change because they felt depressed. They didn't even worry that they were going back to their ex who was not going to make anything better. Should statements. Jagmeet Singh should put forward a no confidence vote. The Bloc should put forward a no confidence vote. Everyone should give Pierre personality disorder a chance to win while his poll numbers are up. In your own life, should statements come in the form of, I shouldn't have been late for work. I should spend more time with my kids. I should be a better spouse. I should really work on that side project that I think will let me quit my day job someday. Yada, 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 yada. One thing Burns suggests is stopping yourself when you notice that you're shoulding yourself to death. Because the word should has a moral dimension. It's not just you recalibrating your plans for next time. Every time you say you should have done something, you're kicking yourself in the pants just a bit and it builds up over time. Instead, the next time you find yourself even in your head saying, I should have done whatever, stop and say, no, next time I will do this differently. Or, if I knew what I know now, I would have done things differently. I regret that this worked out this way, and I think if next time I do things differently, it will work out better for me and those I care about. Did you feel a bit uplifted there? Be kind to yourself. You're generally not fucking up on purpose. Labeling and mislabeling. On a personal level, this can be when we do negative self talk. We call ourselves a loser or unattractive or unlikable or unlovable. If you find my videos enjoyable, you're probably at least a little bit cool. You like learning and you like laughing. And those are things that other people like about you. An example of labeling that happens in politics is Trump style nicknames that people like Pierre personality disorder love. For example, calling Carney carbon tax Carney, despite the fact that Carney has made it clear he plans on ditching the carbon tax. Or when Pierre called Justin just inflation, despite the fact that inflation happened all over the world because of the sort of people who line Pierre's pockets. Should I stop using nicknames for toxic politicians? I'd love to. And if we can get Canadian politicians to elevate the level of political discourse, I'll gladly follow suit. But it's worth noting that all of my nicknames line up with who the politicians actually are and what they do. Pierre is clearly mentally unwell and unbalanced. Doug Ford is alleged to have dealt drugs in his youth, and he uses alcohol as a cynical political tool. Scott Moe is boring, and he has killed at least one person due to drunk driving. And Danielle Smith is part of a secret order of evil space wizards. These are all just facts. The last one is personalization, and this one is about guilt. Personalization causes severe guilt because we assume that things that aren't our fault are our fault. For example, if you're pushing your late 40s and you realize that somehow you've never had the chance to save meaningfully for retirement, and now you're just realizing that when you do retire, there's no way that you'll be able to top up your pension and OAS to even be able to afford rent, let alone groceries. That's not your fault. Like maybe you did spend a few too many nights out drinking with friends, and maybe you didn't need that Pikachu Squishmallow. But realistically, none of us should be looking at retirement and thinking that it's our fault that we won't have enough money to retire. If you never had enough money to buy a new car, how could you have really put down enough money for retirement? My entire generation had our futures robbed by Reaganomics, imported from the US, and we don't deserve the future that's coming. So, yeah, those are Burns's 10 cognitive distortions. If you enjoyed this, you can check out David Burns's book, or books. They're super easy reads, and feeling good in particular is one of the reasons I'm still alive.